Hi and welcome to DeepDive's YouTube channel. We're happy you joined us again, and this is I Think I Love My Job. If you are new and you don't know me, I am Kalifa Oliver, the resident expert here at DeepDive on all things employee experience. What are we going to talk about? The ethics of employee listening. Let's go. As organizations become better and more savvy at listening to their employees, they run into privacy issues, ethical issues, legal issues that they often have to deal with very quickly. And in a lot of cases, when a lot of these systems are being designed, these things are not taken into account. And often these type of surveys and tools and listening programs actually can help you before ethical problems actually arise in your business, because they allow you to collect data and get ahead of it. So I'm here today to just talk about some things to consider in terms of ethics when you are designing, carrying out, or even thinking about a listening program. Privacy is really important, and confidentiality is really important too, because a lot of times when somebody is answering your survey, they are bearing themselves to you, and they are being vulnerable. And this is especially true when there's open text comments. You have got to be very, very careful about how you treat it and who has access to that data. You have got to consider what is being said within the survey, and again, most especially with open text data, because you do not want information to get back, and you do not want any retaliation to happen, because it puts If we focus a little bit on open text, think about the type of information that comes in. There can be all sorts of ethical and legal violations that somebody may write down for your analyst. And you have an obligation at that point to refer that data over to employee relations. You have an obligation to ensure that somebody who is giving you that information is aware that that is the next step. Because in a lot of cases, if you're not clear that that is something that's going to happen, it can create this fuzzy issue with trust, ethics, and legal, and you want to avoid it. So one of the things that's really important is to make sure that in your listening program, your respondents, your employees are aware as to whether it is an anonymous survey or a confidential survey. And a refresher on confidential versus anonymous is anonymous surveys cannot be traced back or identified to an individual. You can ask for information on the survey, but it doesn't necessarily mean that information is going to be accurate or reliable. Whereas your identified data generally means that it can be identified back to an individual. Usually a unique link is sent to that person. It's tied to the HRIS file. Data that comes in from a confidential survey should only be reported in aggregate and only be seen by few people, a team of analysts, and perhaps a vendor. It should never, ever, ever be seen by on an individual level by a leader. It should not be seen by their manager in any way, shape, or form. It has to be protected. This brings us to the other thing, that if you're looking at team level data, you should always make sure that if you are reporting back to the team, you are aware of the amount of responses that are being sent back. My recommendation is, if a team has less than 5 responses, they should not receive it, because you are opening a door for identification of an individual, which is not something that you want to do. The other thing that is really important from a legal and ethical standpoint is making sure you always have very clear disclaimers on your open text data and your survey data as a whole, but particularly your open text data, about referral or escalation to employee relations or whatever the group is called that handles investigations and allegations in your survey. You need to make sure it's very clear that this is the next step. That person needs to be empowered to decide whether or not they really want to leave that information on the survey, knowing that as long as it is identified and read as a potential violation or a potential claim that needs to be investigated, that there is a next step that will happen, and it means that they will then have potential individual level identification on the part of that investigative group. The other thing from an ethical standpoint, if you think of open text, is the use of word search versus the use of more advanced modeling. A lot of organizations focus on using word searches, which would be words that they've already identified as critical issues, so discrimination, harassment, for example, that they've identified, and so they will search the data for those words, and they will use that in order to decide whether or not this needs to be escalated to an investigative group. However, it is really critical that you move with the times and use more advanced and emerging technologies such as natural language processing and machine learning, where you can identify trends and patterns in the data. It allows for sentiment analysis and prioritization, so that you're also identifying things that go beyond your scope and understanding of what may be actually happening in the organization. It allows you to ensure that your bias as the person who is designing or analyzing the survey is not baked into all steps of the continuous listening program and process. You also have an ethical responsibility and a legal responsibility to think about the privacy of your employees and respondents that you are using on your surveys or even on your data scraping tools when you look at intranets and external posts that someone might put about your company. You have to think through, for example, what are the laws in a different region. So the laws in the US are not necessarily the same as the laws in the UK, right? And even within states, it's different. So, for example, in Europe, there is GDPR, and it's not necessarily clear what it is, but you have to follow it and focus on it. And in those cases, that means that somebody has the right to say they do not want you to keep their data, and you need to delete their data because they have the right to know exactly how their data will be used, right? So you have to be very, very aware of that. And some states are working on their own policies that are very similar in terms of data privacy. And so you have to constantly be aware. You have to, in any continuous listening program, really work closely with your risk and legal teams so that you are constantly staying up to date on what you need to do, what you need to consider during analysis and reporting, and you always want to make sure that you are considering all things, including the differences between regions and differences globally. From an ethical standpoint as well, once you collect the data and the data is seen, you cannot unring the bell. You now have an obligation to report the data exactly as it's seen. You should not be trying to tailor the report to meet any preconceived standard or try to tailor the report because you don't want to get a leader mad, or it doesn't sound like something that you think is correct or a leader will think it's correct. You have an obligation to report the data as it is. The data needs to drive the story. The story cannot drive the data. And sometimes that creates discomfort. But as an analyst, as somebody who's responsible for a continuous listening program, as a data scientist, it is important and imperative that you stick to the true integrity of the data, or your program is just a show. And if you plan to have a show, don't have a program. Because continuous listening programs often create and collect a lot of data over vast amounts of time, you have an obligation to report any data breaches as soon as they happen, because it is important. People have to trust you. A major part of a successful continuous listening program or any survey or any assessment or any sort of listening function is trust. You get the most data when there is true trust. And if the trust is eroded, if that trust is lost, your program will not succeed, it will not function well, and you might as well not have it. Data is powerful. People data is very powerful. Always remember that when you're looking at people data, that every data point is tied to an actual human being, and there are real life consequences to any decision that is made using that data. So you hold a lot of power in your hands when you build a continuous listening program and when you need to report any data that comes in. So it's important to be ethical and responsible. It's important to recognize that you have a responsibility to every single person who comes into contact with your program and every stakeholder related to your program. Always remember that continuous listening programs are powerful tools and amazing tools, and they can be extreme powers for good if used correctly and done correctly and designed correctly. And it is an amazing and exciting thing when you see a continuous listening program within an organization work at seeing how it can really impact and empower employees, and how your employee experience can really be affected in such a positive way. I hope this discussion about the ethics of listening programs was helpful. I hope that it can help you with any decision that you're making as you're building out a program, as you're thinking about building out a program, as you're thinking about even just doing a survey to start listening to your employees in some way. If you have any questions or ideas or thoughts, don't forget to leave it in the comments. I'm always happy to read it and to discuss. And once again, if you like what you've seen or heard, don't forget to subscribe to DeepDive Talent Insights and Analytics channel. I am so happy that you've joined us today, and never forget, there is always room for a brilliant experience.